Reversal of autism in 2 to 3 weeks? That's just nuts. There's no way that could happen. This guy is just completely crazy for even saying it's possible, right? There are probably quite a few of you that, if you did watch that video of this incredible and courageous mom who shared the story of her child's essentially transformation within a very short period of time, that's probably what some of you thought. Or others are like, how the hell is this possible? Like, it's not possible. It is possible. And I've just in the last probably 3 or 4 months had 24 children with either autistic features. Some of them were not labeled as autism, but had heavy sensory issues. And also some children with PANS and PANDAS that were presenting in all kinds of unusual ways in their ability to socialize, transform. But the story of this little guy didn't start with just this treatment. And that's the thing that oftentimes is overlooked. The treatment, which was itraconazole, was really the icing on the cake. It was the last piece that brought everything together. But the mom and I had been working for over a year to set him up and prepare his body for this treatment. So to give you a backdrop of this little guy, when he was around a year and a half, he started becoming disengaged, which sadly is very common, right? Which is typical time that we associate with regressive autism. He started losing function. He started becoming more socially disengaged. Language never really developed. And around 2 years of age, he had such severe congestion and so many ear infections that ultimately he needed to have ear tubes placed. Now, when you look at the literature, what you find is that allergies, recurrent ear infections, airway problems are rampant in kids with autism, except no one ever thinks to say, well, how is that connected to the onset of autism, right? Except it is. And when you go even further back and you ask, what else happens to these little kids even earlier on, what you find is that rates of gastrointestinal issues, rates of colic, rates of sleep disturbance are also through the roof, like 200 to 300% higher in these kids than the average population. Now you may be asking, well, Dr. K, what the hell does that have to do with autism? That's just the ear, nose, throat and colic. Like, what does colic have to do with autism, right? Everything. It has everything to do with autism. Because when there is some kind of gnarly toxin exposure, and it turns out in the case of this little guy, they had mold early on in their home, which I see commonly as a significant driver for intense inflammation in the ear, nose, throat region, and intense inflammation and congestion, which ultimately leads to ear infections and ultimately ear tubes. It also causes adenoid hypertrophy, tonsillar hypertrophy. And for those of you that are interested, just do a search for damp environment adenoids, and you'll see a published article that talks about this. So all of this is out there. It's very well known that mold causes allergies, causes congestion, causes various kinds of allergic reactions. But no one ever puts together how that is related to what we call autism, right? So long story short, this little guy had exposure early on. And then as we started testing him, it wasn't just a mold. He had iron deficiency, he had zinc deficiency, he had a lot of neuroinflammation. So what we started to do now, going back almost 9 to 12 months ago, is we started building up his system. We started calming down the inflammation. And in doing so, this little guy who at one point was only drinking formula started eating a few foods. He started sleeping better. He started becoming more calm. His hyperactivity was so bad that we ultimately put him on guanfacine, which is a medication, it's a blood pressure medication that ultimately calms the nervous system, and that helped. But it wasn't just that. Like, he still had the same challenges. He was still disconnected. He was still had echolalia, but no actual intentional expressive language of any sort. He certainly was not connected the way the mom described. He was calmer. He was better. Then we tested their current home, and it turns out they had mold there. Not horrendous amounts, but they had mold. And the family couldn't move. They couldn't remediate. So we found clever ways to take care of it. They started implementing deep cleaning protocols. Basically, they got rid of all the excess stuff in their home. They started dusting and cleaning a little bit. The other thing that the mom did, which really made a difference, was she installed a negative ion generator into the air conditioning unit. And literally within a week or two of doing this, suddenly this little boy with autism was more calm. He was sleeping better, his diet improved, he was more calm. The same way that the guanfacine and the other treatments helped. And basically, these negative ion generators are these little machines, and they're literally a tiny box about that big, that emit these imperceivable, we can't sense them, electrostatic charges that comes into the air. And basically, these electrostatic charges stick to particulate and cause them to cling to each other, mold toxins being one of these particulates, mold spores and mold fragments being other things. And essentially causes all of these particulates that we inhale to stick to each other and either stick to the surfaces or fall to the ground. It turns out these negative ions also have very mild antimicrobial effects in direct contact. Not they serve as antibiotics in us, but when they come in contact with bacteria in the environment, they actually start changing the cell walls of the bacteria, not us. And through that, they actually cause the bacteria to not flourish the way they do, which happens in mold, contaminated water, and damaged buildings. So we did that, and we controlled the environment, which helped further. We kept working on his gut. We used immunoglobulins. We used a few things to help. And all of that started setting the stage. And then once we brought the itraconazole on board, that is what allowed the transformation. Now, you may be asking, well, how the heck does an antifungal reverse autism, right? So if you ever look at the work of Dr. Andrew Campbell, he is a mentor and friend of mine. And Dr. Andrew Campbell, and before Dr. Andrew Campbell, Dr. Sid Baker actually published the case report. If you have a child with autism, you should check it out, where Dr. Sid Baker basically poured a gallon of itraconazole, like doses way higher than I would ever feel comfortable doing. And what he found was about 6 to 8 weeks later, one child with full-blown autism had reversal of those symptoms. The doses they were using were 3 to 6 times as high as I was, and they were giving it daily. And I personally don't feel comfortable with that, because then you have to worry about liver damage and liver enzymes and do blood draws on little kids, which I think are awful. But what they didn't do was set the stage for this medication to work even at small doses. Now, why would this medication work? Like, why are these reports? And then for Dr. Andrew Campbell, he's posted multiple videos. He's published a lot of articles on this. So don't think like I'm the genius that figured this out. I'm just following in the footsteps of these brilliant people that have kind of paved the way. But why would this work? It turns out that itraconazole is not just an antifungal. It's actually an anti-inflammatory. And part of what itraconazole seems to do is improve leaky gut. So leaky gut, guts falling apart, it actually helps the cells start connecting. It decreases inflammation within the nervous system and systemically, and it also changes the behavior of the fungus in the gut. Now, why is that important? What I have learned, and this is through lots of trial and error and testing the children and learning from them, is, at least in the kids, what we call mold toxicity is ultimately a gut-mediated toxicity. Meaning, when a child is exposed long enough to mold toxins, and you could substitute any other toxin for the same thing, that toxin causes a disruption within the entire gastrointestinal tract. It disrupts the microbiome, it disrupts the gut permeability, it disrupts the gut immune response. It changes the short-chain fatty acids, so butyrate, for all of you pouring butyrate into your kids are not producing butyrate on their own because of these toxins. Literally, it flips the entire gastrointestinal tract upside down. And every single piece. It disrupts IgA production, which is the immunoglobulins the gastrointestinal tract produces to protect itself. It changes the mucin layer, which is the kind of mucus layer that the gut produces to protect itself. Literally, it changes and disrupts the entire barrier. And when it does that, something really weird happens. You get inflammation now that's from the gut that gets into here. And that inflammation specifically induces glial activation, microglial activation. And if you want to check this out, just type in microglia autism, and you will see some really well done studies clearly demonstrating that microglial activation is present in kids with autism. Now, why is that important? Well, on top of disrupting neuronal function, on top of tripping up the limbic system, which controls fear centers, guess what the glia do, the microglia? They're the housekeepers of the brain, if you want to say. They are the cells that kill off neurons that shouldn't be there. And they're basically, it's like your gardener, if you have a yard, and your gardener is constantly tending to your plants and kind of pruning some plants back and, shaping and molding your garden. Imagine you had this beautiful house with this huge garden, right? Except, what if your gardener suddenly went psychotic and instead of trimming your bushes, they took a chainsaw and started just cutting your bushes down and just literally slicing and dicing to the point where you're like, what the hell? Like, there's nothing left of my garden because my gardener just literally tore apart everything. Hedges are gone. Roses are just cut down to the base. Like, there's nothing left of everything. When the microglia are disrupted the way that it seems to be in these children because of the gastrointestinal disruption that can come from any heavy toxin exposure, they completely disrupt neuronal functioning because all the circuits that should be firing properly are suddenly flipped upside down. And you don't need to take my word for it. Type in microglia neuronal pruning, microglia neurons. Like, do your own search. You don't trust me. I'm just some random guy on Instagram, right? Do your own search. And what you will find is a terrifying amount of information that not only looks at this in how it presents in autism, but you will also find a lot of information in neurodegenerative disease, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. And as you go through this literature, which I have done, you get to a point where you're like, oh my God, what kind of brain damage is coming from this neuroinflammatory response? And now we ask, well, why the heck would the microglia get so pissed off from the gastrointestinal tract, right? Why would this happen? Like, why would the gut getting disrupted cause the brain cells to start tripping up? And some people say, well, it's the vagus nerve or whatever else. It turns out, and this is just a theory, we don't know for sure, but it turns out that when you get substantial leaky gut and you get disruption of the microbiome, which is the bacteria there. See, now you have funky bacteria that should be in small amounts, now in large amounts, and those bacteria are having a field day. So they're producing their own stuff, right? All that stuff leaks through the gut and gets in here. One of the things that we know is part of that stuff, these substances, is lipopolysaccharides, LPS, or bacterial endotoxins. And it turns out that these bacterial endotoxins, on top of being just highly, highly toxic to pretty much every system, including this thing up here, it turns out that these bacterial endotoxins, these LPS, trigger these receptors. They're called toll-like receptors, TLRs. And specifically, there's TLR4, but there are multiple of these TLRs. And it turns out that these toll-like receptors that are on the microglia and the mast cells that are also up here happen to be highly, 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 highly sensitive and reactive to these bacterial endotoxins, these lipopolysaccharides. So when these lipopolysaccharides start floating through the bloodstream and end up here, they cause a massive inflammatory response. And it makes sense, right? If all of a sudden the bacteria are dumping their toxins into your body and now your immune cells are like, what the hell is that? Why is that over here? And now they start tripping up and reacting to try to protect us. Except that protection comes at a very, very high cost. You end up getting a cascade of events that then could present as what we call autism. And if you want data to back that up, also type in lipopolysaccharides or LPS or bacterial endotoxins and autism. And what you also find are several studies that are well done that have also clearly demonstrated that children or individuals with autism have substantially higher levels of these bacterial endotoxins than healthy controls. So these are not things that I've made up. This is all part of the literature. It just for some reason hasn't yet made it into our clinical practice. And when all of this happens, in addition to basically the brain cells being kind of sliced and diced and the connections being severed, and it's like having a PC and half your circuits are not working and it's just constant, right? Except it's a beautiful child who is trying to be in the world. And if you can imagine like just having the most horrific brain fog and emotionally, neurochemically, things are not firing, because when you get neuroinflammation, you get weird compounds like quinolinic acid, which can disrupt serotonin and dopamine. If you do a search for microglia and oxytocin, literally just type in those two words, what you will find are several studies, one of which spells it out in plain language. Microglia play a predominant or dominant role in control of oxytocin production. And they also happen to affect oxytocin receptors. You know what oxytocin is? It's the connection chemical, right? Oxytocin is what helps us as human beings connect with others. It's that chemical that when you're a mom and you're breastfeeding and you just feel this enormous connection and love with that little human being, that's oxytocin. For those of you parents who just become enamored with your child and it's just you're overwhelmed by love and connection, that's oxytocin. When you have inflammation, when you have microglial activation, that entire pathway just gets shot to hell. It's like someone coming with a shotgun. And unbeknownst to me, I apparently was part of this population, because now in retrospect, I see that oxytocin had never fired correctly in me. It had never functioned correctly in me. But it's not just that. In addition to all of this, when that inflammatory cascade happens, because the microglia happen to be best friends and buddies with mast cells, and literally imagine having twin sisters that just love each other and text and call every day, all day. And when one twin sister gets completely disrupted and like her head is not in a good place, guess what happens to the other twin sister? Also not in a good place. And it turns out that mast cells that are in the nervous system that also get triggered by these lipopolysaccharides dump a ton of histamine in the nervous system, You know what that does? Disrupts sleep. So you get wired and you can slow down. And what do we see in a lot of kids with autism? They either have a hard time falling asleep, right? So you give them a gallon of melatonin, they fall asleep for a few hours only to wake up again. And some of you parents with children with PANS and PANDAS, same thing, same pathway. But also there are other weird things, right? Why do these kids do that? Why are they so overwhelmed by their environment? Why did this little guy have such extreme eating where he only wanted formula at some point in his life? Sensory distortions. Histamine distorts sensory pathways. Period, heart stop, end of story. Histamine disrupts sensory pathways. And when it does so, you get weird things like suddenly tactile sensitivity in the mouth is completely distorted. So if your kid does eat anything, chicken nuggets, mac and cheese, maybe some pizza if you're lucky, You get appetite suppression because guess what? Histamine also modulates appetite, right? For those of you who have had 15 cups of coffee in a day, you don't have a whole lot of appetite. That's through glutamate, similar pathway though. So for this little guy, we set him up to be able to then benefit from low doses of itraconazole, just conventional doses 3 times a week, so we don't have to worry about liver enzymes. And just through a tiny bit, because we were now reducing that inflammatory response in the gut, we sealed up his gut, which allowed the bacterial endotoxin levels to drop, which allowed the microglia to chill the hell out, which allowed the mast cells to calm down, which allowed the histamine to calm down. Through that, what we were able to do for this guy, and again, I've had countless children, in over 2 dozen in just the last few months, that have presented in exactly the same way. Mommy, I love you. Is Sissy okay? The connection, the presence, the cognitive changes, like the most beautiful part of this is parents are like, oh my God, he has started doing things that he never did before. And it's not just more connected and calm. All of a sudden, we see this beautiful intelligence and just awareness of the child start shining through. Why? Because that toxic soup and massive inflammatory response that was in their nervous system is calming down. So their brain is actually able to function properly and efficiently and effectively for perhaps the first time. And these stories are important because there are many of you parents out there who are looking at your child, or some of you, yourselves. You're saying, what the hell is going on? And it may not just be autism. It may not just be PANS and PANDAS. And how we're diagnosing PANDAS is a whole other story that we can talk about another time. It could be severe depression. Type in microglia depression. You will be floored with the studies that are out there that are looking at how this neuroinflammatory response is tied to depression. Type in microglia and PTSD. Type in microglia and fill in the blank and see what you find. And that's just one piece of the larger picture, because the microglia are not just doing their thing by themselves, right? We have these toxins that are constantly bombarding the brain, that are coming from the intestines. And in our current practice of functional medicine, it's like, well, avoid this, avoid that, avoid this. And I'm not saying any of like BPA or phthalates or glyphosates are good. But we're missing the elephant in the room. And you know why we're missing the elephant in the room? Because at this point, our technology to assess gut function, our technology to assess these lipopolysaccharides, frankly, sucks. The only way to do it, and you have to really know what you're doing, is to use immunological testing. One of my favorite labs is called Cyrex Labs, except it turns out that Cyrex is not very good for little kids. There's another company called Precision Diagnostics that has a gut permeability test, which is excellent. There's another company called KBMO, which has a finger prick, which is great. Except it turns out that about 30% of the kids who are really, really sick because their immune systems are completely shot, they actually have a low immune response because we're checking to see if the antibodies are attacking these lipopolysaccharides, and you can't assess that. And outside of research laboratories where someone takes the blood and immediately analyzes it, you can't assess these lipopolysaccharides. So at this point, where we are is we are like in the Stone Ages of our testing modalities. But it doesn't mean that because our testing modalities are in the Stone Ages that these things are not true, because all of this has been clearly demonstrated to be true in the research literature. And why I'm sharing these videos is for me to bring awareness around these concepts, because I can tell you in my holistic functional medicine world, very few people are talking about this. And very few people are talking about it as it relates to autism or other neuroinflammatory conditions. So I hope these videos are helpful. And I hope that especially this description has helped you understand how we were able to create that story for this little beautiful boy to start shining in the world and to start thriving in the world. And for all of you parents who feel hopeless, who feel lost, who feel sad, because you're getting to a point where you're like, what if there's nothing that can ever be done to help my kid? And I have nothing against medications. If medications help, great. I prescribe them. I think in the case of this little guy, I was the one that prescribed guanfacine and it helped. But we need to get beyond that. And we need to say, yes, medications can help. Yes, medications can control symptoms. But what the hell is driving this dysfunction? And as we get more sophisticated in asking these questions, and hopefully at some point in time we have more sophisticated tools to assess these things, we can get to a point where we can really make even a bigger difference. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you found it helpful, share it with others. Share it with your provider, or share it with providers that you know. And help me bring awareness around these things and help me get this kind of information into the world, because it's badly, badly needed. And I believe in all the other things we use to treat autism. Trimethylglycine, totally helpful. High doses of folate, totally helpful for some kids. But when those are the only things we discuss, those are the only things that most providers look for, and we completely ignore this entire other domain, when 1 in 4 people are exposed to mold, and when that happens in any home that someone lives in, right? In the case of this little guy, it was the first home that he was exposed to that really derailed him. Those statistics go up even higher. That's just one example, but we need to have these conversations. We need to start opening our eyes. And as we do, we find information that can make a big difference, that can ultimately help many, many, many people, and many little kids have a brighter and healthier future. And thank you for helping me create that in this world. You all be well. This is Dr. K.